You wake up every day fighting a battle you have already lost in your mind. You think Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire because his father left him a superior military machine. You assume the Sarissa spear, the densely packed phalanx formation, and the heavy companion cavalry were the defining physical variables that brought the known world to its knees. You are entirely wrong. If you handed the exact same Macedonian army to any other general of that era, they would have stalled at the Hellespont, secured a few coastal cities, and negotiated a comfortable treaty with the Persian king. We fundamentally misunderstand the mechanics of absolute victory. We look at historical dominance and we attribute it to resources, to geography, to physical leverage. The actual fulcrum of Alexander's conquests existed purely inside his skull. He possessed a psychological framework that most people find alien, a framework you currently lack, but desperately need if you want to extract any actual leverage out of your time on Earth. Strategy is not a document you review quarterly. Strategy is the operating system running in the background of your consciousness, while everything around you catches fire. Why did a 22-year-old king, heavily outnumbered, choose to march his men directly into a rushing river to attack an entrenched Persian army at the Battle of Granicus? Every established rule of military preservation dictated that he should wait, flank, or retreat. He attacked because he understood the macro strategy of narrative momentum. He knew that the Persians were not fighting a man. They were fighting a myth. If he hesitated, he was mortal. If he bled but kept moving forward with an almost irrational momentum, he became a force of nature. He was forcing the enemy's mind to defeat itself before the spears even crossed. He was manipulating the secondary plot of war for psychological theater, while everyone else was obsessing over the primary plot of the physical battlefield. This brings us to the core operating system of his life, the historical view of oneself. You walk around treating your failures, your bankruptcies, your divorces, and your public humiliations as terminal events. You view a devastating loss today as the final period at the end of a sentence. Alexander structured his mind differently. He operated as if every single moment of his life was being recorded by an unseen historian. When things degraded to their absolute worst, when he was wounded, when his men were starving, when he was cut off from supply lines in hostile territory, he did not view it as a catastrophe. He viewed it as the necessary second act of a legendary narrative. If my life were recorded in history, he thought, no matter how bad things got, this specific moment of absolute despair would be recorded as the prelude to a massive victory. You need to install this framing in your own mind immediately. When your business collapses, when your reputation takes a hit, the weak mind spirals into panic. The mind operating on Alexander's algorithm observes the collapse and says, if a historian were writing the biography of a great man, this is exactly the chapter where he faces ruin before orchestrating an unprecedented comeback. By removing yourself from the emotional immediacy of the disaster, you gain structural leverage. You become an observer of your own life. Panic requires absolute identification with the present moment. Strategy requires distance. The historical view of oneself provides that distance instantly. It converts raw misery into actionable fuel. It changes the way you walk into a room when you are fundamentally broken. How do you defeat an army 5 times your size when you are pinned against the sea and completely out of supplies? This was the mathematical problem Alexander faced at the Battle of Issus. King Darius had amassed a force so massive it seemed to cover the earth, severing Alexander's communication lines. Standard military doctrine dictates that you consolidate your forces, dig in and pray for terms of surrender. Alexander marched directly at him, but he did not march blindly. The question of how to beat a larger force has a counterintuitive answer. You do not fight the whole force. You shrink the board. Alexander manipulated Darius into positioning his massive army on a narrow coastal plain, flanked by mountains on one side and the sea on the other. Darius had hundreds of thousands of men. In that narrow funnel, the vast majority of them were mathematically useless. They could not deploy, they could not flank. They were entirely negated by geography. Alexander took his elite cavalry and drove them like a wedge directly into the center, right at Darius himself. You spend your days fighting on open plains against forces larger than yours. You try to outwork massive corporations. You try to outspend people with deeper pockets. You spread your limited energy across 15 different projects, hoping one will hit. You are fighting Darius on an open field. You will be crushed by sheer volume. You must find the narrow pass. You must restrict the battlefield. Focus your limited elite resources on a single decisive point of friction. If you break the center, the rest of the massive army routes. This is macro leverage. You do not need to be bigger. You need to dictate the geometry of the conflict so that the enemy's size becomes a logistical nightmare rather than an advantage. Let us look closely at the architecture of the phalanx itself, because it is the perfect physical manifestation of a business system. You look at a phalanx and see men holding spears. What you are actually looking at is a machine designed to remove individual panic from the equation. A man standing alone with a shield will eventually break and run when a chariot charges him. A man locked into a 16 by 16 grid, his shield overlapping with the man next to him, his sarissa projecting forward alongside 15 others, cannot run. The system holds him in place. The system forces him to be brave. Your business, your daily routines, your dietary habits, they all rely on individual willpower. Willpower is a man. Standing alone on a field, it will break the moment the fatigue sets in. It will break when the chariot of market volatility or personal tragedy charges at it. You must design systems that lock you into execution. Make it harder to fail than to succeed. Create an environment where retreating requires more effort than marching forward. If you rely on feeling motivated to execute your strategy, you are leading an army of mercenaries who will desert you the moment the gold runs out. Build a phalanx of habits that operate mechanically, devoid of emotion. There is a sickness in modern strategy. People believe that if a problem is too difficult, there is honor in pivoting. We rebrand quitting as strategic iteration. Alexander did not pivot. Consider the siege of Tyre. Why would a king spend 7 grueling months building a kilometer-long land bridge through deep ocean water just to conquer one single island city? Tyre was an island fortress, considered completely impregnable. The Tyrians laughed at Alexander from their high walls. He had no navy. They had the strongest navy in the Mediterranean. Any sane strategist would have left Tyre alone and marched down the coast toward the riches of Egypt. Alexander understood a macro principle of systems. An unaddressed anomaly in your rear will eventually destroy the entire structure. If he left Tyre undefeated, his aura of invincibility, the very myth that was winning battles for him without shedding blood, would shatter. The world would know Alexander had a limit. If Tyre stood, rebellion would brew behind his lines. So, he ordered his army to literally move a mountain into the sea. They hauled rock, timber, and dirt inch by inch under heavy arrow fire, building a road through the ocean. When the Tyrians sent fire ships to burn the bridge, Alexander didn't pivot. He ordered the bridge built wider. When they dropped boulders to block his siege engines, he mounted cranes on ships to dredge the boulders out of the sea. This is the application of extreme clarity and absolute execution. When you encounter a bottleneck in your systems, whether it is a flaw in your product, a toxic partner, or a personal limitation, you usually build a workaround. You bypass Tyre and hope it doesn't sink your supply lines later. Stop building workarounds. Find your tire and build the mole. Dedicate the agonizing, monotonous, unglamorous months to dismantling the obstacle completely. The act of doing something so irrationally committed breaks the will of your competitors. When the world sees you building a road through the ocean, they stop trying to fight you. They realize they are dealing with a machine that does not possess a reverse gear. We move to Gaugamela, the final confrontation. Darius has learned his lesson. He chooses a massive, flat plain. He literally levels the ground. He clears the brush. He calculates exactly how fast his scythed chariots need to move to shatter the Macedonian lines. He optimizes the physical board to absolute perfection. He outnumbers Alexander massively again, but this time, there is no narrow pass to funnel them into. How do you win when the enemy has optimized the board against you? You shift the theater of war. You refuse to play on the board they prepared. Alexander deployed a tactical formation never seen before. He marched his army at an angle, drifting continuously to the right during the advance. He was dragging Darius's army out of their carefully prepared ground. Darius, terrified of being flanked, stretched his left wing to match Alexander's drift. In doing so, Darius created a microscopic gap in his own center, a tiny tear in the fabric of his line. Alexander was not fighting the entire Persian army. He was waiting for that single gap. The moment it opened, he formed his cavalry into a massive wedge and drove it perfectly into the fracture, aiming straight for Darius. The Persian king broke and fled, and the entire empire collapsed. You were trying to fight on the competitors' leveled ground. You were matching their marketing spend, copying their features, mirroring their routines. You were playing their primary plot. Shift your movement. Drag them into unfamiliar territory. Force them to stretch their resources until a gap opens in their core competency. And when that gap appears, you abandon all defensive posture and strike it with absolute, concentrated force. Let us return to the secondary plot, the internal mechanism. Strategy is not something you do. It is how you process reality. At the edge of the known world, in India, Alexander's men finally mutinied. They had marched for years, bled across continents, and they refused to go one step further. Alexander sulked in his tent, but he eventually conceded. The return journey required moving. The army through the Gedrosian desert. Why march a tired, battered army through a wasteland that had swallowed entire empires before him? Some say it was punishment for the mutiny, but look deeper into the architecture of his mind. Alexander was obsessed with surpassing figures of myth. Cyrus the Great had supposedly lost an entire army in that desert. Semiramis had barely survived it. Alexander went into the desert to do what the ghosts of history could not. He was still playing for the historian. He suffered catastrophic losses there. The heat and lack of water destroyed thousands of his men. The environment accomplished what no army ever could. In the middle of this blistering hell, a soldier found a small helmet full of dirty water in a dried riverbed and brought it to Alexander. If you are the CEO, if you are the leader, you drink the water. You rationalize it. You tell yourself the organization needs you alive to function. You convince yourself that your survival is critical to the mission. Alexander took the helmet, looked at his dying men, and poured the water into the sand. He refused to drink if they could not. In a single micro-action, he secured absolute macro-loyalty. The men, witnessing this, pushed through the desert. They realized their leader was bound to the exact same brutal reality they were. You claim you want to build systems. You claim you want leverage. But you exempt yourself from the friction of your own systems. You build a business and immediately try to outsource the suffering. You demand loyalty, but pour the water down your own throat while your team suffocates in the trenches. True leverage requires asymmetry in conflict, but total symmetry in suffering. You must engineer your external battles so you have every unfair advantage, funneling your enemies into narrow passes and dragging them off their leveled ground. But internally, among your own structure, you must take the heaviest burden. You cannot dictate extreme execution if you operate in comfort. This is the final equation. Combine the historical view of oneself with the ruthless execution of macro leverage. When you face a crisis tomorrow, do not react like a victim of random circumstance. Step out of your own body. Look down at the timeline of your life from above. Recognize that the historian is watching, pen in hand. This specific disaster is the raw material required for a legendary counteroffensive. Funnel the problem into a narrow pass. Negate the enemy's size by forcing them to fight on your terrain. Do not pivot away from the impregnable fortress. Build the agonizing road through the sea and tear the walls down stone by stone. Create systems that lock you into bravery so that running away becomes impossible. Drag your competitors off their optimized ground and wait for the gap to form. And when the desert strips away every comfort, when you are left with nothing but the dry wind and a desperate team looking to you for a signal, pour the water in the dirt. Show them that the myth is real. You are not a collection of random, disconnected events. You are a historical record currently in production. Act like it.